everybody. Hey, everyone. How's it going? Let's get over here. How's everybody doing today? Welcome to this week's Griscom stream. Really happy to be back, y'all, after a very frustrating COVID-19 experience. It wasn't too bad, but it's just one of those things where it just lingers on forever. I feel like it's actually been months since I've been able to do one of these. So very happy to be back with all of y'all. And as always, feel free to drop questions in the chat. Would definitely like to be able to catch up with some of y'all, hear what you're thinking about these days. I wanted to talk a little bit, I think I'll wait a little bit, about my piece that just came out in Jacobin magazine on taxes and climate policy, particularly, some of the kind of tensions that we're seeing. I mean, the reason I wrote this piece, and this is just a brief intro, we'll get into it later, but the reason I wrote this piece is because what I'm seeing play out here, one, worries me because of what it means for me and my family and friends, but two, because it really is a window, I think, into what climate policy might look like in a lot of other places in the absence of a real sustained working class movement to try to find a solution to this, right? It's going to be individual responsibility nonsense. It's going to be an attack on unions. It's going to be an attack on workers, lower standards of living for people, while the rich, they find a way out of it. And I think that that's something that we need to take very seriously, because I think a lot of people on the left sometimes, because so much of the fight for so long has been about, do you believe science or do you not believe science? That I don't think that there has been enough investigation into what we actually mean when we're saying we need to do something about climate change. But we'll get to all that in a second. Feel free to drop any questions or anything like that in the chat. But before we get into some of the stories and things like that, I wanted to take a little waltz down memory lane, if y'all will indulge me a bit, because I saw this just before we went live, so I haven't worked through it. And, sometimes I won't say I miss these days, because they were pretty frustrating. But I do look a little fondly on the kind of real extreme Russiagate paranoia stuff that we were dealing when Bernie Sanders ran for president, both in 2016 and 2020. And I'm wondering how those folks have been doing. And lo and behold, they're still on the same bullshit. So I figured we could share this thread maybe as an appetizer to get started today. This is from, not too surprising, an account that has basically completely dedicated their life to the Russiagate stuff, to Mueller, hoping and praying that was going to turn into something that was viable or political, which, as we all know, it didn't. But, you wonder what they're up to in 2022. And as you can see here, right now, they're wanting to return to a simpler time. Let's read a little bit of this thread from Mueller. She wrote, I'm worried that what happened in 2016 is going to happen again. For anyone who forgot, people pushed so hard for Bernie and against HRC that when their candidate didn't win the primary, they were also full of hate for HRC. They didn't vote or voted third party. Again, I'm not going to be one of these people who demands that folks show up, necessarily for the Democratic Party. I do think that, there's times where making a strategic choice can be helpful. But it's probably one of the least important political decisions that you make in your life. But I want to note that this nonsense right here, that like a bunch of the Bernie people didn't vote for the Democratic nominee, has just been disproven time and time again. But they continue to hold on to this kind of fantasy that because Hillary Clinton, lost because we have an extremely absurd anti-democratic system in this country, despite getting the popular vote, they want to blame people like Jill Stein and Bernie Sanders voters for the failure of Hillary Clinton, right? I'm sorry. Like, if y'all saw this is no real shade at Jill Stein, but like, if you were somebody like Hillary Clinton, who's been in politics your entire adult life, with all of the resources behind you, with all the strategizing behind you, and you're losing because of somebody like Jill Stein, because you can't pull people away from a protest vote of Jill Stein, I don't know what to tell you. But it's pretty fantastical to blame that person and that movement for your failure. I think that not campaigning in Wisconsin and Michigan probably had a little bit more to do with that loss than Jill Stein. But anyway, going on. And Russia, who is still interfering in our elections, exploited that hatred of HRC and sowed down chaos to such an extent that it impacted our elections. Now, let's remember what the quality of the Russian interference in the elections were in 2016, right? There's so many stories about this. Remember, and like, I don't want to dedicate this whole stream to this. It's just like a fun thing to do at the top, but I do get really frustrated that there has been zero accountability for the fantastical narratives that were being pushed by the mainstream media. I remember very early on, the Washington Post promoted that complete bogus site, Prop or Not. Y'all probably aren't familiar with them because they're little freaks who basically created this website where they said that they had, you know, real insight as to what journalists and news sources in this country were actually covert Russian agents. And they were throwing everybody's names on this list. Everybody's names on this list with no reason or accountability or methodology, just a list of people that some folks on Twitter who bought a URL were saying were Russian agents. And the Washington Post published a story based on this false reporting, which was extremely damaging. I remember, one of the groups that they were targeting was Counterpunch, which at that time I was just starting out, writing and working in left media, and I was writing for them. Absolutely baseless and absurd claim, but one that could have real chilling effects on journalists. And if you remember, the result of this was this call for more censorship, and you started to see, for example, Facebook starting to push down views of alternative or independent media sites, right? Really, really damaging stuff. Again, with no real data or information to back it up. So just remember that when they're talking about the Russians interfering in our election, the things that the Russian bots actually were doing, and there were Russian bots. I don't deny that, but people forget what the kind of stuff that they were promoting was. There was a site that the Russians put out. I can't remember the name of it, but it was basically like a Texan secession page, right? And they were trying to organize rallies that never came to be. And they were making these posts in like really strange, sometimes when you've seen something that's been translated into English for like, by like a non-native speaker, you get those ads on, Instagram, YouTube, and things like that. And it's very clear that there's something off in the language. That's the kind of quality of stuff that you were getting from these kind of Russian disinformation ops. I remember one of them was so funny. On the Texas secession one, they just had a bunch of posts where it would say, "We love the Texas shape." We love the Texas shape. Do you love the Texas shape? Which, don't get me wrong, I mean, I do, I guess, love the Texas shape. I have plenty of things with with the outline of Texas on it. But like, that's not how anybody talks, right? I just like want to remind folks of like the low quality of this stuff. And it's important because, there's a whole segment of liberals in this country who still are going to cling on to this narrative 6 years later, despite everything that we're seeing going on right now. When they got their way, they got their boy Biden in. The stuff that was out there was really, really, really low quality. And there's been a refusal to investigate why Clinton lost the election. And then here we go. They even hacked the DNC and DCC and released emails to harm HRC and promote Bernie. I'm not saying Bernie was in on it. Well, why'd you even bring that up? But they exploited that division, and it worked. That in concert with Jim Comey taking it upon himself to announce a probe 11 days before an election. Now, let's also remember what was in those emails, right? Yeah, those emails were leaked, right? Certainly, they're leaked by somebody who wanted to see the Clinton campaign do poorly. But it's interesting how they always ignore what was inside of those emails. What was inside of those emails was the fact that the Democratic Party and the Democratic leadership were actively campaigning to rig the primary elections against Bernie Sanders, right? That's a huge deal. And that is the kind of information that if somebody is about to become the president of the United States, that, I'm sorry, is very much in the public interest for people to know. Again, there's no reflection on the fact, well, maybe Hillary Clinton and the TNC shouldn't have been actively campaigning and rigging an election against somebody who was trying to play fair ball, right, with them. No, it's so, they make it seem like this stuff was made up instead of it actually exposed serious, serious corruption and rigging of this election. That fucked us up and we ended up with Trump. Um, I'm for free healthcare in college. I'm for expanding the court to 13 justices. I'm for banning assault weapons. I'm for blah, 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 right? But I'm not for us helping the GOP win by pushing so much hate for damn candidates that when they win their primaries, people have become convinced that both parties are the same. And folks should send a message by not voting. Again, this is the kind of, with this group of people, and I'm sorry to do this throwback segment. I mean, this is from today, but throwback to these kind of arguments that we were all getting into regularly when Bernie was running in 1620. It's always amazing that, during the primary, it was, we can't criticize the Democratic Party because there's a big election, right? When they're in power, we can criticize and we can push them and we can challenge them. The first step is to make sure that Joe Biden and all these people get into power, right? But here we are. It's July, and we can't talk about the Democratic Party at a moment right now where women's rights to healthcare are being stripped away, and all we're getting is like very frantic fundraising emails from Nancy Pelosi. I mean, it just shows something that we already knew, was that these kind of excuses, like you can't criticize, you can't talk about this kind of stuff, was all just cover to say that we can never talk about these things. It's not situational. It's not. We need to have unity going into this election. It's a forever and always kind of thing. And I know I'll get dragged for this thread by the hard left. I've received death threats. I'll be whatever. There'll be a host of misogyny and hate heaped on me, but I can take it. I've survived worse. Well, very brave. But I just can't sit and watch quietly and watch what happened in 2016 all over again. I will push them leaders. Well, you just said that you wouldn't, right? You just said, I like these things, but I'm also not going to criticize the people who are preventing me from getting those things. But in 2016, risking attacks and threats, I stepped into the booth and pulled the lever. Jesus Christ. Attacks? I don't know. People were being threatened at the polls by Bernie Sanders supporters. I think that's a pretty wild thing to say. I didn't help the GOP then, and I won't now. I will fight for my candidate, but I will elect Democrats even if I don't get my way. The alternative is the end of democracy, and if you think that's a good thing, we won't just lose our seat at the table. We will lose the whole damn table. Now, I think the threat to democracy is a very real thing. And you know what they should be doing if they're worried about democracy is beefing up the struggle against the Supreme Court. That's like the biggest threat that we're facing right now, because it's looking very, very likely that the Supreme Court might make a ruling very soon that basically allows state legislatures to nullify election results. That would be an end of democracy moment. And that will come from the Supreme Court, an institution which is allowed to have its power because Democrats are weak and spineless, while Republicans are willing to not play by the rules, while Democrats continue to venerate these unholy institutions. I mean, I don't know. Again, it's not surprising that people who went all in on this kind of stuff are still all in on it. But it was a little bit of a fun throwback to be able to to see that again. Yeah, let's see. I'd be happy to take a couple questions from y'all, and then maybe we can look at this Jacobin piece and a couple other stories. But yeah, it's amazing the kind of stuff that people suck up and act like other people aren't worried about these things. No, people were worried, for example. For example, in 2020, people were very worried that Biden wouldn't be standing up for the right to an abortion. And we're seeing that play out. And that's why people campaigned so hard for Bernie Sanders. It's just a joke for people who got everything that they wanted now to continue this nonsense. Yes, we do love the Texas shape. You must love the Texas shape for freedom. I'm not joking. I don't have it prepped. I'm not going to make y'all wait around while I look these things up. But you can find that. I believe Washington Post published this piece on this Texas secession page. I mean, the stuff was really low quality. And if you're sitting here thinking in 2022 that that's what the deciding factor was, not the complete failure of the Democratic Party, not just to run a candidate who was interesting or attractive to most people, but also just to campaign well, right? They weren't even running ads or a serious campaign in states that Trump was able to swing from the Democratic Party after years and years of Democratic dominance in those states, right? This kind of like very myopic viewpoint that these people have about 2016 is amazing. And look, there's a reason that this kind of, I mean, this is like, not to get too psychological about this, but like, this is the easy, it's easier for those people to believe this kind of fantastical narrative about 2016, right? That it was this insane conspiracy, and they didn't play by the rules and the Russians, rigged the election, instead of dealing with the fact that the Democrats lost to an extremely beatable candidate in Donald Trump, and that our system right now is a joke. And we've now seen in my lifetime 2 elections go to the loser because of this archaic pro-slavery system that we have. And there's no real push to change that or shift that. But there's a lot of bullshit about fake news and Russian meddling, which has really not been proven at all. I'm more of a Wyoming shape kind of guy. I find Colorado's shape real tacky and distasteful, though. Kind of offensive. I don't know if I get that fully, but no, of course. I mean, this is always a good point. When you talk about interference in an election, how quickly they forget Yeltsin and an actual U.S. public they use not just to manipulate Russian elections, but to bankrupt post-Soviet Russia. A great point. And, who was leading the country at that time? William Clinton. Yeah, that's true. Criticizing Dems after an election is as taboo as talking gun control after shooting. Anyone asking me if I want Republicans to win can take that question upstairs to the Democratic Party leadership and incumbents, which I think is a fair point at this moment. I mean, it's amazing that like we're seeing the crisis moment that has been threatened for so long, which is the rolling back of basic human rights in this country, and we're getting nothing from the Democratic Party. And again, they want to fixate on third party voters who, again, like they did. That was not what swung the election. It's like this is just based like in every election, there's always somebody third party, typically. Um, Not so much in 2020, in fairness, but like, typically somebody who's going to run and pull 3, 4, maybe 5% of the vote. Like you have to be able to factor that in at this point. If you're winning the popular vote and you're worried about the margins like that, you've run a bad campaign, and it's dangerous and it hurt the country very badly. But again, the focus of the blame should be on the party, not these kind of things. Because again, it's like when it's something dispersed and almost like imaginary in the sense that like there is no real structure that you can critique. Then non-voters, like third-party voters, right? It's a lot easier to just throw that out there in perpetuity than dealing with the actual structure that controls access to the ballot in this country, that controls power in this country. Does the DNC have any idea how pissed their party is at them? I think so. I mean, I think they've known that there's a huge disconnect between them and the base of the party for a long time. I think that they don't care. I mean, I make this point that like the Republicans they want to like suppress democracy, right, through denying certain people the right to vote. But Democrats, they try to manage democracy because they don't want like full participation. And you only need to look at a state like New York to see that. I mean, look, because I'd voted in the South my entire life, and when I lived in New York, registering to vote, engaging in that process there was one of the most restrictive that I had experienced. It was truly amazing, particularly to be able to vote in the primary. And I know people who tried to vote for, like, there's one thing that was really difficult for Bernie in those kind of states was that, in New York, you have to get registered so far in advance. And I'm not saying it's a utopia or anything like that in the South. It certainly is not. But the point there is like, okay, well, why is the Democratic Party making it so much more difficult to vote in a state like that, was because they want to manage the voters. They have their people, and they don't want that pool to increase because it threatens the establishment and the incumbents that they have there. And you have to remember that about the Democratic Party, is that no doubt about it, voter ID laws, these kind of restrictions that are being put out there by the GOP, are set up to, suppress democracy. What the Democratic Party does when it's in power is they try to manage the voters. They have no real intention of expanding the voting bloc. See if we got any questions before I'm scrolling down. And then we can maybe get to a couple of these stories if they're ready. Well, you want to do this? You want to start in the UK? I don't have too much on this, but I do think it's worth up, and we'll probably do a longer segment on it next week. I didn't hear about this. Jules says, anyone hear about Tim Lockman, the cop that shot Tamir Rice, who's got hired in Pennsylvania this week? I did not see that. That's pretty frightening. How much of a meme is this? I'm no expert on Illinois politics, but all I've seen is the meme here, so that's about all I can say on that. But yeah, okay. MDR wants to hear about Bojo. Bojo, one of our better exports to the United Kingdom, a great American export to our former colonial leaders. Yeah, he had to step down, and he stepped down in a way that is just so beautiful, and it really is moving. And let me just play it for y'all because it's the most Boris Johnson kind of turn of phrase I've heard in a while.
And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. I want to thank Carrie.
I'm looking forward to one day having to resign something like that in Scandal. I need to come up with a good homespun phrase to put on the end of it. I mean, the story could really, it's one of those things where if, it was pitched to a TV show, you wouldn't believe it, right? Particularly, I mean, he's been embroiled in scandal because he threw a party at the height of COVID restrictions. And then also, and I think more urgently, because of very serious allegations of sexual misconduct by a fellow deputy chief whip, Chris Pincher. Chris Pincher. Yeah, it's just it's comical, and I shouldn't laugh too much because I know it's a rough moment. I mean, look, it's a great thing to watch Boris Johnson lose, but the sad thing is that, like, what does this actually mean materially for British politics? I mean, it means you're going to get somebody who's a little bit less rambunctious, combs his hair, versus Boris Johnson. Remember, Boris Johnson was the tool of British capital, to smash not just the kind of Corbyn movement, but the Labour Party itself did a great job at destroying that, but to implement pretty extensive austerity in the country. And that's not what he's resigning for. He's not resigning for the failure of COVID policy. He's not resigning because of the horrifically racist immigration policy that were set up under his office. He's setting up because he's stepping down because of scandal. Yeah, good run-ins to Boris Johnson. Fuck him. But it's one of those things where it's just like there's the celebration on a personal level that Boris Johnson is losing and has lost. But no, it doesn't seem like there's going to be any kind of tremendous shift. I mean, because even if power shifts to the Labour Party, I mean, under Starmer, what the Labour Party is the second most friendly though they are competing very, very passionately to become the number one most friendly party to capital in the United Kingdom. It's a really dark time. I mean, remember Keir Starmer, who was the successor after the coup against Jeremy Corbyn, is somebody who was threatening members of the Labour Party that if they showed up to support one of the more popular and largest strikes in UK history in my lifetime, that they would be facing discipline and punishment from the party, right? Incredible discipline to protect the interests of British capital, but not the same kind of discipline to put forward any kind of vision for the country that is significantly different from the United Kingdom. There's some pretty great pieces that have been written, one by Daniel Finn in Jacobin that I highly suggest people check out, and by, I believe, David Adler, that really lay this reality bare. We'll see. It's going to be, for people who aren't familiar with the process there, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a leadership election in the near future. It looks like it's going to be pushed out towards September. So Boris Johnson will be able to hold on to what he, in his own words, is the greatest job in the world for another couple months while they continue to gut the state and social programs in the country, while the Labour Party, just sort of quietly marches along with them as they continue their move from a party of labor, from a party of the working class, to a party of the rich and powerful in London, and a kind of social elite who were sort of upset by the rhetoric and the look of Brexit, and the way that Boris Johnson talked about taking away benefits from people, but not too really worked up about the substance of that kind of stuff. So, goodbye to a chapter. I mean, Boris Johnson, Boris Johnson was probably one of the funniest leaders left. And after Trump was kicked out of office here. So, RIP to really, really good material for streaming. Let's see. Well, thanks so much for the super chat there, Hegel. I mean, yeah, it's a joke what ended up being the final nail in the coffin for Boris Johnson, and it's a sad state of affair for politics, and truly what they've done with the Labour Party in the United Kingdom is one of the more depressing things I've seen in the past few years in politics. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn really represented a pretty vibrant opportunity for something different, but I think that we can't just sit around, and in the same way with Bernie Sanders, we just can't sit around and lament what could have been, but start doing the serious work. And I think that the move, for example, in the United Kingdom, from trying to fix the Labour Party, which maybe was unfixable, we really just won't know. But moving away from that and moving back into organized labor and the rank and file movement, I think is a very encouraging sign, because I think there's something that we could learn a lot from in this country. I mean, Mick Lynch, that's who I'd like to see be prime minister in the near future. I believe he is a Strom, is a Boris Johnson of Turkish ancestry. And I also believe he was born in New York City, too. Well, Daredevil says the thing is because of homophobia that Johnson stepped down, or is Britain better at responding to this in America? Clinton, Trump, and Biden have all faced sexual harassment claims. Well, it's a different system, right? Where for a president in this country to resign would mean that you'd also lose the control of the office. Where they just changed the leader, so you don't have to hold a new election or create a crisis like you would have in this country, right? I think just the way that it's set up there, it's a little bit more responsive to shifts at leadership than the American system. You're still on this, friend. Good buddy from Australia, Radium Theatre Production, says pop culture is better than barbecue in American football, which I think is very, very wrong. Actually, I'm very much looking forward to football starting up only another month. Let's see. All right. Well, maybe throw your questions in there. I'll get to those in a minute. But I wanted to up this piece I just had out in Jacobin because I think it's a good one. And thanks so much, Sean Guide, for the really excellent edits. It made the piece really strong, I think. But this piece is up in Jacobin if you haven't seen it. Texas shows the pitfall of liberal climate politics. I'll just read the top line here. The climate movement must be rooted in the labor movement. Otherwise, we get individualistic solutions that throw workers under the bus and only grant reliable green energy to those who can afford to pay for it. Texas is a preview of our climate future, fossil fuel capital hunkering down and waging war on workers. Patchwork Small's beautiful attempts at a solution and a heavy reliance on the same market-based approach that created the crisis in the first place. And, for a while now, I've been wanting to talk about, public power and electricity. I mean, for folks who remember me at TMBS, in the GEM segments that I would do there, where we just basically do some quick, financial news updates. I dedicated a lot of those talking about public power and the failures of that system across the country because of disinvestment, because of capital pillaging these systems, and because we've sort of lost the language in this country to think about these things as public goods, and have really inherited and accepted, I think, as a country, a very neoliberal mindset to a question that affects us all. I mean, electricity touches everything. It's how you power your home. It's how you cook your food, right? I mean, these are very, very important systems. And the move into the hands of private capital has been extremely dangerous. And there's no better example of that than Texas, where we have one of the most deregulated systems in the country, one of the most marketized systems in the country, and we saw the consequences of that being quite deadly in Winter Storm Uri. And I wrote this piece because one thing that has sort of irked me or made me worried is that, a lot of times, because we do want to move off of fossil fuels into other systems that are renewable, like, utilizing some wind and solar. And as people know, I also think that we really need to be re-upping our nuclear game in this country, nuclear energy as well, because what we're trying to do is transition an entire economy from one system into another. And that means that there are going to be questions, there are going to be challenges that we need to start figuring out what we're going to do, right? And that's just on the technical side of like the actual production, but then also thinking about the entire model of work and labor within those systems. And there has been, and I won't lay this claim against the entirety of the environmental movement, because there's a lot of people who have been doing incredible work on this. We bring them on our show to talk about it. But there has been this kind of refusal to sort of investigate the questions of what, a transition will look like. And, I was very inspired by the Bernie Sanders call for a just transition. I think that that's the way to do this. But I've also started to feel like the just transition as a slogan has almost become a bit of an excuse for some people. And what I mean by that is, again, not that just transition is a bad thing. Just transition is what we need to do. But it's sort of like, oh, no, we wrote down on our policy proposal, we're going to do a just transition, so that's done. No, I mean, that needs to be a much more serious commitment, not just on the level of political support, but again, in the same way that when we talk about Bernie Sanders, if he were to come into office, he said, it's not me, it's us. We need to have a movement there to show up. A lot of people are like, well, that's great. Bernie's talking about us. He really believes in us. He's like, no. If you understand anything about the American state, it has deeply entrenched powers and interests that aren't always going to work lockstep in with the democratically elected government. So to overcome those systems, particularly in a context where Bernie Sanders wouldn't be coming into power with, a socialist majority, right? He'd be trying to deal with liberals, and we see what they do even with a liberal president. We would need to have a very, very organized and committed labor socialist movement to be able to push those things into power. And the analysis that Bernie Sanders made was right, but the work just wasn't there. And with something like the Green New Deal, that work needs to get started now. And So I talked to my friend Ron Pollock, who's a really great organizer here in Austin with the IBEW. We talked about a lot of different stuff, and it's unfortunate I wasn't able to get it all in the piece. But he said this, and it really stuck with me, his line here. He says, it's not enough for people to say this is what could happen, that this will be here in the future. It needs to be tangible, or else nobody's going to believe you. And that's like a real threat. And that's a threat on the question of just transition and our climate politics. But that's also a question that we have with the entire project of our kind of democratic socialist movement right now, is like, we can convince people about Medicare for all we want, but people need to actually believe that that's something that we're capable of doing. And until we start doing that work, we're just promising people a nice future, which again is the starting point. I'm not saying don't do that. But sometimes people think because we have an answer, that's the same thing as having a movement, if that makes sense. So I wanted to use Texas to make this argument because Texas, I think, is a little bit ahead of the rest of the country. One, because of the hyper deregulation here, right? And because it's on its own grid, it sort of operates internally as its own country, at least in terms of energy production in some ways. That like this is a real future that we could be seeing. So, I go through what happened with the oil and gas industry in 2020 to make this point that oil and gas workers in the state of Texas saw what a transition might look like. And what I mean by that is when demand for oil and gas plummeted, what did the oil and gas companies do? They didn't take care of them. They said, fuck you, go home. And they fired, an estimated 60,000 workers in this period of time. All while they were getting, millions upon millions of dollars from the federal, right? Which just goes to show how these corporations operate. I also wanted to make the point, because I think some people miss this too, is that, there's this real threat, and it's not just a Texas problem, it's big in Louisiana and New Mexico, that when you have these boom and bust cycles in the oil and gas industry, you have all of these wells getting set up across the state, across the country, and then, the price of gas plummets. So it's some of those wells stop being profitable. So they just sit there abandoned. And the state makes you pay a fee up front to plug them, but it's not enough money to plug them. And because of the boom and bust cycle, I mean, it's like, if you're not familiar with like the actual technical level stuff about how the oil and gas industry works, like, you will be amazed when you look underneath the curtain, because it is a mess. There's all these shell corporations. It's one of those things, like the same way after the financial crisis, people, their house or the building they were living in was getting foreclosed on, but nobody knew who owned it. It's very similar with oil and gas wells, where it's just like there's so many shell corporations that it's sometimes hard to figure out who actually even owns this well in the first place. So there's all these abandoned wells in Texas. So even if you take best case scenario, we move completely off of fossil fuels, we have this huge environmental crisis of these wells that are, unplugged, and, they can create problems. They can explode. Methane leaks into the air, which is extremely, dangerous gas for climate change. They can leak into the water, and that happens. Entire areas, particularly in West Texas, have water that's been contaminated, and it's just such a very clear irony of the American capitalist system, where the profits are privatized and the social cost is socialized, right? Because the state is going to end up having to pay for these kind of things. I also noted, so these are just some of the things that we have to think about when we're thinking about going up against these institutions, right? Is that, one, they don't care about workers, and that should be an in for the socialist movement with those workers. And then the fact is that what we're seeing right now is not an expansion of unionization in that industry. It's a contraction. So ExxonMobil is just one that I noted, but it's happening across the industry, across the state of Texas, but also in other states in the country as well. That, these big oil companies are waging war on unions and are pushing decertification campaigns against them, right? So they're trying to get rid of union labor right now. Those are fights you should just be there immediately. We covered what happened in Beaumont along the program, but like that was a fight that went on for 10 months, was extremely damaging. And these are the kind of fights that we just, as a movement, right, not just as like some media operations covering these things from time to time, but as a movement, need to be showing up for. They knocked off the decertification campaign, but barely. Right. So like the state of work right now in the oil and gas industry is really, really bad. And there's ideology stuff that's difficult to get through because people who work in that industry, they have this kind of mentality that's like, well, this is a boom and bust industry, buck up, be tough, you know. But we need to find ways to cut through that and to support unions, expand unions, and certainly be defending them when they're under attack, because the big socialist argument for a transition from fossil fuel into a Green New Deal kind of policy, where some form of a socialist transition away from fossil fuels, is that labor needs to be there. And I think most people listening to this program get that in like a theoretical sense. But I'm really trying to make the argument that we need to move that from a theoretical argument into a practical argument. And that means showing up not when, a Bernie Sanders coalition or something like that is in power, but showing up today, because, we can't build up these coalitions randomly and haphazardly when we have certain opportunities. We need to be doing that work right now. And especially when we're out of power, political power, I mean, right? Building up the power of labor to direct production, to shut down production if it's needed, to challenge ExxonMobil, all these other oil companies, right? We need to build up that capacity today. And people aren't going to start showing up for you if you don't show up for them. And also, we have a case that can be made. You've got a preview of what these corporations are going to do to you in the near future. You saw how expendable they view you. This is why you need union protection. This is why we need to be involved in this movement. And we have that argument, but until we start building the structures and that commitment, the argument doesn't go very, very far. Also, I don't know if I should do like a full rundown of the piece, but I did want to note this because I think this is a really important point. Just like, why are gas prices so high? And luckily, we're starting to see them creep back down again. But it's a really fascinating little bit of a reminder for folks who might sometimes stray away from the Marxist analysis of oil and gas, right, into like a moral one, right, where like we need like, oh, if only we change the heart of the CEO of Exxon or BP or whatever, they'll realize they don't want to poison the planet. No, they're going to continue doing this as long as they can, because these systems are set up to make profit. And what I mean, I mean that like literally, they are set up solely for the pursuit of profit, even if that means temporarily keeping oil in the ground. And one of the things that's really fascinating here is that, you get all these Republican talking points. Oh, the left, Biden's a Green New Deal guy, which is bullshit. He's been approving, rivaling Trump in his approval of new oil and gas wells, giving out more permits. He's sprinting against Trump on this. Why were they not producing oil? Well, one, because they fired everybody, and it's very hard for them to re-up those systems after they basically let all those people go. And two, because when they get this windfall of cash that comes after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they take the money that they get and they don't reinvest that into production. They invest that in paying off their shareholders in the form of dividends, so that they can shore up their financial position, to remind them that, like, look, we might have bad cycles from time to time, but no, investing in oil and gas is a sure bet. And what does that mean? More money floods into that system, and the potential of those things starting to ramp down become, that timeline gets pushed years and years and years down the line, because banks, financial institutions, and rich people who are invested in this system want to see returns on their investment. And what we saw with the high gas prices, and they're still high now, but luckily, as I said, like, they're starting to creep down a little bit. What we saw there was that the master of oil and gas is not, as much the personal wills or feelings of the people at the top. It's finance capital. And that's why a socialist critique is always going to be much stronger than a moralist critique or anything like that, because it realizes that the engine of this system is the pursuit of profit. And until we address that engine, we won't get very, very far. And the last bit here, and I'm going to go through and read through y'all's comments and questions on this. I'm hoping that you'll have a few here, because I'd like to hear people's thoughts on this. The last bit is on this thing that I'm seeing happen right now, which we call energy for the rich, which is where you see this grid fail. And immediately the fight is a culture war fight. It's like, do you like wind and solar or do you like natural gas, right? And look, there's facts to the fight about what systems failed, and the systems that failed were natural gas, right? Um, but the natural gas systems failed because they weren't weatherized. Why? Because on a pure market-based operation, it makes more sense for those pipeline owners. And what I mean by they weren't weatherized, they didn't have protection. So when it got so cold, the pipelines froze over. They made the decision not because they were stupid or because they didn't care or didn't think that this might be a potential liability for them, but they realized that it's going to be cheaper for them in the long run to maybe take a couple days where those pipelines are out of operation than to pay the money to weatherize those systems, right? Again, it's just showing that until you start thinking about the money and the interest behind these systems, you're not going to get very, very far on it. And the last bit is something, and this is not even unique to Texas, but I think it's important here, is that what you saw in the aftermath of Winter Storm Uri was that you see this huge boom in residential solar. And as I say in the piece, on a personal individual level, I can't blame somebody who has the means, to pursue something like a household solar unit, but one that's not a statewide or nationwide solution to our energy questions. It's a personal one. It's an individual one. And if you have the opportunity to opt out, people who have money will opt out. And that's a threat because it doesn't take a lot of thinking to realize that, well, if all of the wealthy neighborhoods, like Westlake or whatever, are able to power their homes with, a nice renewable green energy system, there's not that much interest in the form of tax or just in the income that's going to those public energy companies for those people to continue paying into the public system, the system that everybody else uses, but to actually try to completely decouple themselves from it. And I'm sorry, if you don't see the way that American ideology, particularly the ideology of rich Americans, functions, if you don't see the way that a lot of these people think as something that it could become a very, very real potential, that they just start trying to argue that, oh, well, we should decouple completely from these systems. We shouldn't have to pay any money. In the same way that rich people who send their kids to private schools say, well, I don't want to fund the public schools because my kid goes to, the $50,000 a year, very expensive, very nice private school, right? Very, very easy to see that reality start pushing into power, which would be really dangerous because we need these things to be big. We need these things to be centralized just on the kind of scientific level of how can you produce power cheaply for the masses? You need those kind of big systems. And, the idea that a lot of these rich folks are going to want to try to decouple, I think is something that we're already seeing the early stages of. So these are the kind of threats that we're seeing, and it's worrying because we really could live in a future where it's we have a two-tiered electric system. And we're already starting to see that here in Texas, where rich people are able to opt into nice, reliable power, and poor working class people have to pay extremely high rates for the power that they're using and have it on a system that is unreliable and extremely dirty, right? So these are the kind of threads of the way that neoliberal capitalism is going to go when it comes to dealing with the climate problem. It's not a solution on their end, but that's what they're going to do. And we need to take that threat really seriously. And the only way, and also just really quickly, do not forget that solar and wind on a labor level are just really, really rough industries right now. Non-unionized, dangerous, because people get paid on per panel model. So you have one guy trying to lift up an entire solar panel up onto a roof, very frequent injuries, things like that. And again, without union protection. And that's work that can be done by union workers. But it's going to take a commitment from us as a society to make that push happen. And the current tax incentive structure promotes these kind of green capitalist, anti-union thing And they all obviously they present themselves with a halo like, oh, we do green power, so yeah, our labor conditions are shit, but we're good guys, right? And we can't accept that kind of thing. We can't import the same kind of neoliberal labor model into the way that we're going to be powering our society. So these are the kind of threats that we have in front of us. The good news is that all hope is not lost. For example, AFL-CIO in Texas endorsed a federal style climate policy that's very much almost line for line Bernie Sanders Green New Deal policy. They didn't use the language, but they accepted that as a policy. So like the ideas are there, but it's finding a way to meet folks where they're at and building up that coalition. And we just won't get very far with any kind of transition if we don't have labor on board. And we can get them on board, but that's going to take a real serious commitment from the left and the green movement in general to that we just aren't seeing as much the default mode of doing politics. There's organizations that are trying to change this all across the country. For example, Texas Climate Jobs Project, which is an offshoot of the AFL-CIO. But we need to see those things being expanded. We need to see left organizations really showing up for that kind of fight. So that's the situation that we're in. And I highly suggest people read and share the piece. Texas shows the pitfalls of liberal climate politics. And yeah, let's see. I'd be happy to look at some of the things that y'all said about this and take some of y'all's questions. Well, I appreciate the super chat, but I'm not going to take any football slander on the chat. Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat too for folks. Our good friend, congressional baseball fan, says, travel to West Texas and eastern New Mexico, and you'll see how many abandoned oil wells there are all over. It's a massive Superfund site with hundreds of towns completely surrounded by it. Yeah. And, remember that, I don't know what the laws are in New Mexico. Maybe it's similar because they have a similar history with Spanish law, where you have a difference between mineral rights and land rights. But a lot of times these wells are on, ranches, smaller family ranches, where a big company comes in and they have access to the mineral rights, and they have all of these protections that allow them to basically go on people's property. They pollute the groundwater and the land, and they basically screw over these kind of small family farms, ranches. And it's extremely devastating. And then they just disappear, and nobody knows what to do about it. There's the Texas Railroad Commission, which governs this kind of thing, estimates there's 7,000 unplugged wells. There's definitely a lot more than that. Lord, $7 a gallon in Canada right now. Well, I hope people can be taken care of there, because that's a huge burden for working people who have to drive to work every day. The system where we don't have public transportation. I mean, the price of oil is very, very important, a metric for the quality of life of working people. So I don't know about these numbers. Polygraph lie detector says, I think 50% of Americans are buying electric cars. I don't know of that stat, I've got to say. I just haven't seen that. But they said, so gas is probably a bad longer-term investment, LOL. So this is the problem with intermittency and with moving to, a pure solar wind systems, that when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine, you have less electricity going into the grid, right? And we're actually seeing that right now. So ERCOT here in Texas just announced that it looks like it's not going to be very windy in West Texas over the weekend. And it looks like we're going to be hitting temperatures in Texas, 107, 110 degrees, which means there's going to be a lot of strain on the grid system, and we're having electricity. We're having less electricity than we're typically used to here at a point of higher demand. And that's effectively what happened when the system failed. So what ends up having to pick up the slack of renewables when solar and wind don't show up and aren't producing? Well, it's coal, natural gas, etc. So unless we build systems that can get through intermittency problems, there's a lot of money in gas for a long while to come. And this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I'm saying we need to think very clearly about how we can build a system that doesn't rely on these things. Because people think that Exxon and these other corporations are really threatened by solar and wind. And certainly they'll make us think, they would like to see there be a bit less of them. But they also think that as long as intermittency is a problem, they're going to be in business for a very, very long time to come, right? Even if we move to electric cars, because we'll still need to create the electricity to power those cars. So that's just something that's really important to remember and think about. Yeah, and this is what happened in Texas. When the grid fails, the price for emergency use skyrockets. It would be a hindrance to profits to stop those skyrocketing emergency prices. I mean, people made a shitload of money in Winter Storm Uri, including the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah, and I know I'm a little bit behind y'all, but a shortage drives up prices, which can also drive up profitability. You can cause a crisis of profit from it too. No, it's like literally in some of the interviews with some of the providers that I've read, they literally compared it to getting a lottery ticket, right? So it's like, okay, we could either be down for a couple of days, or if we don't freeze over, we're going to make a shitload of money. And Texans have been struggling, particularly people in the higher deregulated systems here, and it's because it's not the entire state. Like Austin, I saw Austin Public Power, Austin Energy, but people who are on, particularly rural people who are on those really deregulated grids where they have like 5 or 6 different providers you get to pick from. All those people got insane bills after the storm, right? And when Abbott kept the electricity price high during the crisis, good old Republicans helping those poor private power companies. Well, they helped him out too. So Abbott got about $12 million in donations from those companies the week after the storm. So I don't think that residential solar is necessarily a bad idea. It's fine, but I think that we should just be producing these things on a mass level. And I think the kind of fixation on solely residential solar is the answer is a bit off, because you still have those same problems with intermittency there, and that's a lot of resources being spent on a particular program, if you get what I mean. If like we have so many resources to produce certain kinds of electricity, is it better to put solar power on everybody's house, thinking about the cost and the labor and all the work that goes into that, versus creating large provider systems that put that energy into the grid, be them wind or system level solar or nuclear power? And this is true too. Cody Roy says you're talking about power, but they're going to do this with water as well. I totally agree with that. And I mean, we're already seeing that. I mean, it's certainly frightening. Jesus Christ, frightening. Yep. And our good friend Matt Faint, it's always good to hear from you, friend, says getting the market to do this is a Rube Goldberg scheme. If government was serious about transition, they'd be getting CCC TVA model together, putting unionized people to work to build and operate infrastructure. Yeah, that's 100%. And I highly suggest I link to in the piece. People read Matt Huber and Fred Stafford's piece in defense of the TVA, because that truly is one of the most feasible models that we have. To meet the crisis, and also a very similar kind of situation where you have a crisis like they did at the time, Great Depression, etc. Climate change is an equally frightening crisis, and yeah, we should be pursuing things like a TVA model that not only do the work of providing power, but doing it with the goal of making it cheap and affordable for working people. Like what the TVA did for the South was huge. not just because it was electrifying it, but it was also providing electricity that was affordable for folks. And that is the second bit that's really important too. Here in Texas, our electric bills have gone up exponentially in the past couple of years. So add on to the fact that you have largely deregulated housing market here. People have seen their rents increase dramatically over the past few years, and they're now having to pay more and more for using the same amount of electricity in their homes, right? Like you need to also have the goal of producing cheap, ideally free electricity for folks. That should be the first step of any kind of socialist, or even social democratic FDR style program. My neighbor just had solar installed recently. One guy worked for 24 hours to do the whole thing. It was totally nuts. Yeah. Again, it's like I, I'm not. I don't think residential solar is necessarily like a bad thing, but that industry has a lot of problems, and we really need to be taking those things seriously and not just treating them as as perfect because they're ostensibly green, right? It's something that's really crazy, and like again, as like socialists, like if you're not in the union movement, if you're not talking to people who are working in this industry, I don't think that you. I think sometimes people think that folks who work in industry are ignorant, which is a really absurd thing that I think a lot of people on the left need to get a lot better at checking themselves on. But they think that people aren't aware of this. So people who work in these industries realize that a job doing solar panel installation is a lot worse than working, at a union job, pumping oil, right, producing oil. And we need to change that calculus really quickly because you can't take a job that has provided people. It's not perfect. Please don't think that I'm saying that it's perfect or a holy industry or anything like that. But people who worked in oil and gas in Texas, like there are people who can't come from working class families who are able to make decent livings off of this kind of thing. And if our whole thing is like we're going to take away your income and learn to code or go work, for $18 an hour installing solar panels, you know, you're not going to win people over. And frankly, if your climate politics are about devastating the working class, then I would also say that you're a political enemy of mine as well, right? They'd be right to say fuck you. Um, and the thing is like there is no reason, for example, that moving to a green future, a green society should be a threat to working people. The only way that it would be a threat to working people is if we allow the same system of privatization of capital above all else to be imported into a system that we actually have the possibility right now of creating anew. And people who work in the fossil fuel industry are very well aware of the current conditions in the green and in green power right now, and it's not extremely attractive to folks. And it shouldn't be a hard thing for socialists to be engaged in that work of changing that dynamic. Thanks, David, for the. I'm sorry, just so I'm about 8 minutes behind y'all on the questions, but I do intend to try to get to all of them. So don't feel I will get to you. But David Hellman says, and I appreciate the super chat a lot. Thanks, friend. It says, chewing over Matt Huber's book. How do you see its strategy going directly into practice? Sorry if you talked about this and I missed it. No. I mean, I think it's a good point. I mean, the first thing, the things that putting the strategy into practice, I think the way that we can start that conversation is thinking about where we're at. So if you are a union worker doing the work in your local, doing the work on your state level situation is incredibly important to be moving the union movement as a whole toward this kind of Green New Deal vision. The left, as it's currently structured, I think the first thing that we should be doing, particularly in these states like Texas, like the Dakotas, like New Mexico, Louisiana, is showing up for these union guys in their fights, right? So showing up for the guys in Beaumont when they were on a 10-month lockout, showing up for the guys at Warrior Met when they're fighting against BlackRock and entrenched Yankee capital, right? Like these are the fights that are right in front of you. They're in your communities, and you can be showing up for it. I think that pivot is really, really important to be promoting and pushing as a socialist movement. I also think, the Huber book. I think the Huber argument also has to come with a resurgence of a left labor movement, right? I would imagine Huber would agree with me on this. That you're not going to get the strategy program that he's putting forward without the movement that's able to put that into place. So the question of how to start strategizing and building that is figuring out the question of how can we make the growing movement. And I always remind people that it's growing because people like to get really depressed about the current state of the left. Get the current growing left movement rooted into the labor movement in this country, because one, we need them. We should be within them already. And two, those are the people who understand these systems much better than you will from the outside. I just cannot express to you enough how frustrating the arrogance I hear sometimes from people on the left who don't work in these industries, who don't talk to people who work in these industries, talk about these industries, because these people know the best way to transition, know the best way to come up with a pitch for a transition for themselves, right? And that's the kind of move that we need to be going into, instead of what we've been getting, which is a retreat back into NGO political culture, right? And you're starting to see that even with some people who support ideas like just transition, it still is very much a child of the NGO apparatus, which we need to wrestle it back and put it back into the hands of labor if we're serious about that. I'd be happy to go more on that if that wasn't satisfactory to you, but I think that those are the kind of starting points where we need to be going. Let's see. Is there anyone suggesting we should reduce the size of the Supreme Court? I say to zero. It seems some forced retirements are in order. Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, I think taking back the power from the Supreme Court that it took for itself, I think is the most important step, rather than any kind of clever fixes about the number of people who are on it or the kinds of people that are on it. That taking the power that the Supreme Court asserted for itself in the very early days of this country has been extremely damaging. And there's been moments when political movements were strong enough and had enough courage and vision to challenge it, from FDR to Abraham Lincoln. And I think that we really need to reclaim that. I don't know if you saw, but yesterday I talked about this, saying that I think some of the things AOC has been saying on this, even though they're not perfect, have been a very good infusion of this concept into American politics, particularly liberal politics, where they have some very weird veneration of the court, despite the fact that the court has been extremely hostile to a lot of their policies for generations now. AOC has been making the point that the court has delegitimized itself, and the court can't enforce anything. The court doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. It requires the other agencies of government to stand in line with it. And the other branches of government, be the executive, or more preferably the legislative branch, should be clawing that power back. To answer your question, I think that we should be reducing the power of the Supreme Court until hopefully it is a relic. Congressional baseball fan says, for the rich, residential solar is very similar to public transit. People who can afford it don't want to pay for it and force everyone else to use it, deteriorating and increase. From that to education, you can just see the way that it's going. Like, again, I just want to be really clear, because whenever I make these criticisms, I get people, oh my God, well, I have a solar rig on my house or whatever. It's like, fine. I'm not against it. I'm not against it. but it's not a solution. It's not a social solution to a social problem, collective problem. I think particularly residential solar is great in rural areas. I have good friends who live off the grid, and solar is a great solution for them. I think that's wonderful. I'm all for it. But we need to not lean so far into it, because again, that's a private individualist system to something like power, which should be a public good, not an individual thing, right? Where like if you're rich, you get power; if you're poor, you don't, right? That's not good. And also remember that the way that the current system is set up with solar power in this country, and this is because the Democrats are very happy to go along with Republicans, is set up to funnel money away from public power into private capitalists, right? Look at what's happening with the TVA right now. One of the bigger threats is these moves to basically take money out of the public coffers in the form of tax breaks that go to these private capitalists here, right? That's bad. And that's something that we shouldn't be playing around with, because that has long-term effects. MDR sends a good emoji, which always gives us the text-based version, but I appreciate the chat very much, friend. We always love when our friends are not working and watching Left Reckoning instead. I'm not familiar with Prop 57 in California. I appreciate the question. I'll look into it. Chief Running says, in my opinion, intermittency is remedied by increasing the number of windmills, solar, geothermal, etc., and storing excess in some or another way. If government subsidized independent solar electric companies' new responsibility. Well, the battery thing, that technology is not here. Most of those aren't able to store, as long as I think some people think that they can. So that unfortunately is not a solution currently. Geothermal, that relies on very particular areas that have the boon of being able to produce power in that way. There is one system that you can put pretty much anywhere, and that's nuclear, and that's certainly what we should be producing to be able to deal with that kind of intermittency problem. I mean, you could build saying what we should be doing is creating more solar and wind. Well, it's like, well, you can have a shitload of solar out there, but if the sun's not shining in West Texas for a weekend, it doesn't matter how many guys you have out there. It doesn't matter how many windmills you have out there. So no, I don't know if that's necessarily the solution. The solution is one, building larger systems so that these kind of time to time questions of low wind days or low sun days that gets spread out over a larger grid. But two, nuclear is something that can be used very well to make that issue not as much of a threat as it is right now. On nuclear energy, check out our interview with Lee Phillips that is up for patrons right now, patreon.com/leftreckoning. It's about 50 minutes talking about all the ins and outs of nuclear power. So the government subsidizes green energy, but notably it can't compete with green energy, which is another big problem. So these aren't government run. I always appreciate compliments in the chat too. Thanks very much, Polygraph Lie Detector. I know that's the truth. Totally. I think this is talking about just transition stuff. Give them guaranteed jobs with dignity and not dismissive marginalization or barbarism of the dole, in his words. That shit's such crap. And, everyone always wants to talk about job retraining programs. They've been doing this shit forever. I remember very clearly, like one of my first media jobs was I had to transcribe Obama Biden speeches, and it was Obama and Biden went into West Virginia and were trying to tell coal workers, like, we'll let you guys go to to school to learn how to code. I mean, you saw how well appreciated that was with voters there, and also those we have people who have incredible insight and skills in producing power and energy, and we should be utilizing that resource to power our future systems. The problem right now is that under the American free market system, there is none of that guarantee, and we need to be demanding that shit changes, particularly in the question of public power. Let's see. I'm glad that was good for you, Dave. Um, yeah, Matt's been trolling Elon Musk today on Twitter. See me and Matt Lex ruining Elon's life on Twitter. Then again, Elon is masochist. It's all market research control. I did not see, but I'll look out for whatever he said to response to Matt. Hell yeah, I'm applying to law school with hopes of becoming an openly socialist judge. Unlikely as that prospect would seem. Well, find a good place where you can run. Okay. Let's see. So I'm trying to read through the questions. Yeah. What I find the most frustrating, I'm talking about abortion. What I find the most frustrating is that good, reliable polls show that the majority of the nation favored our abortion laws, and like WTF, like 60% at least. Yeah, and as I said on the show yesterday, like even in Texas, and I think it depends on how you frame it. Like I think there is support for certain restrictions, but certainly there wasn't the support for the extreme early ban that they put in place, and now certainly that it's prohibited. There's less support for that, and I think that's one thing that's so frustrating with the weakness of the Democratic Party in this moment, where it's like they have the public support behind them, but they are unable to act. And it's also, a good reminder that the Republican Party is continually representing a smaller and smaller segment of the population, which is very dangerous. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I think that more geothermal is great. Geothermal heating and cooling ought to be used more than they are. They are newer geothermal heat pumps that aren't nearly as space greedy and heat and cool way more efficiently than anything else. I think that's certainly a way to go. Yeah, Lee Phillips, though it's spelled Leigh. I highly suggest his book too, Austerity Ecology. I can't remember the entire subheading, but it's a really phenomenal book. I mean, we had him on the show yesterday. If you missed that, it's in the main show. We'll clip it up probably this weekend or Monday too. The nuclear power discussion is for patrons only at patreon.com/leftreckoning. But I wouldn't be surprised if that makes its way to the public feed sooner or later. Appreciate the super chat. You can store energy in a literal pile of bricks. What are the building blocks of organization that need to be fostered, taught, developed for progress towards a socialist future? I mean, I think the most important thing is joining into an organization, and the organization I suggest people join into is the Democratic Socialists of America, which has the most pull and the most organization and the most reach right now. And that's how you engage in politics as a collective rather than as atomized individuals. And remember that, like, one of the important points of socialist politics is that it's not individual operation, it's a class-based one. And taking organizations like the DSA and truly turning them into mass popular organized movements of the working class as a whole is crucial. And the only way you're going to get that is through a real commitment to labor. And one thing that I think has been really encouraging within the DSA has been a push for what they call the rank and file strategy, which is a commitment. But I mean, y'all are socialists. You want to change things. And it tells people get a job in a union industry in your community. And that's a great way to have more socialists in the labor movement and vice versa, more labor members, more union members in the socialist movement as well. What about AOC's plan to have abortions on federal lands? Is that possible? Yeah, why not? Why not? I mean, there's logistics stuff they'd have to figure out, but why not? I heard the courts could knock it down. Let them play chicken with the fucking court. I mean, this veneration of these people, I don't get it. Cool. Kavanaugh doesn't think you should have an abortion. All right. I mean, but even if they don't have the balls to go that far, do it and let the court take a year and a half to rule on it, or whatever they need to do, and provide that service in the interregnum until you can either codify the law nationally or whatever, or even if you aren't able to do that, provide services for people when they need them, when you have the capability of doing it. Just like that's not a losing thing. In fact, that's much more mobilizing. It'd be much more mobile. I'd feel much more comfortable. It'd take a lot for me, but that would move me a lot more in telling people that it's worthwhile showing up. For example, in the midterms, than fucking Nancy Pelosi sending out threatening emails 24/7. All right, let's see. I'm gonna try to get through some of these a little bit faster, if that's all right with you all. Luckily I am recovered, but I'm still a little sleepy from COVID. I gotta admit. Matt made a good point about was it Matt? Oh, I'm sorry. What caller made this point? I forget your name. I apologize for it. It was Dave. Dave from Jamaica. He made the point that like all this kind of grand stuff about space exploration is not going to come from people like Musk, and I think that's probably correct. Thanks God, Cat, for the super chat there. I'm sad I don't get to see the emoji live here. Well, that's already like the jobs guarantee program for grad students and journalists, friend. We can't be taking that away from folks. There we go. Good to hear from you, Kowalski. I really appreciate the chat, friend. Sorry for leaving you all hanging on the lack of John Brown last night. The tornado recovery has been exhausted. We had a lot of community support, which was amazing. Solidarity is real with people. I mean, I'm happy to hear that there's been a good social response to that. I'm really sorry. I mean, it seems like they hit your community really hard. I'm happy to hear that you're safe, man. It's okay if the fire of John Brown might have been a little low last night. But I'm happy to hear that y'all are okay. And I'm happy to hear also that y'all are working together to figure things out. Observer says, convert electricity to mechanical power, lift the pop bricks up high, then release the potential energy by lowering the bricks when the sun's not shining. I appreciate the chat. I'm not an engineer, so I can't really speak to the mechanics of that. I don't know, but I appreciate the chat. Musk says self-driving cars are a year away. Well, I'm glad they're on the road already and killing people. David Hellman says unionize Buc-ee's. I'm all for that. I'm very much for that. Thanks for the chat there too. All right, y'all. I appreciate everybody hanging out. It's always good hearing from y'all. Again, I'll just re-up it one last time. The piece in Jacobin is Texas shows the pitfalls of liberal climate politics. It was great hearing everybody's thoughts on it. If you would, I'd appreciate y'all sharing it out with folks in your network, trying to get some eyes on it. And as always, feel free to reach out to us at Left Reckoning. Why don't I share this with y'all real quick? We did this in the post game yesterday, but we got merch coming up. We got t-shirts. Matt's been wearing, and I hope washing in between wears, the our big text on fire Left Reckoning tank top. We also have hopefully a shirt with a couple of well-loved figures on it and the Left Reckoning logo. We're also going to have this hat. We're trying to go for a little bit of a wide breadth of things. I don't know if we can do mugs just yet. Maybe we will in the future. I always want to find a way to do things affordably for folks and make sure that they're good quality. But we're also going to have these hats out very soon as well. I think that, as I was saying to Matt, I would like at least a portion of our merch to be the kind of thing that when first glance you might think it's a kind of NRA or a right wing piece of clothing, and then find out it's actually our left socialist project there. But yeah, we'll be putting those out pretty soon. Hopefully next week, if not the week after. So keep your eyes out. This Sunday, Milton Alamati, our good friend and teacher, very good friend of Michael Brooks as well, will be joining us to talk about his new book, Manufacturing Hate, how the West learned to demonize Africa, something along that line. Sorry for forgetting the subheading, but it's a really incredible book. Subject matter is tough. It's about how the New York Times, American media, for 150 years plus, I don't know why he capped it there. He writes about Thomas Jefferson and stuff that Thomas Jefferson's been saying about Africa. But the long time cultural media project in this country to demonize, dehumanize, insult Africa and Africa as a continent and African people in particular. It was a really great conversation. It's always wonderful listening to Milton. We learned so much. Check out that book. Again, it's Manufacturing Hate by Milton Alamati. Be sure to check out his work at Black Star News as well. That will be out for patrons this Sunday. You get access to that at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Totally appreciate all of y'all. We got mini slouch hats, barbecue aprons. That's a good idea. I'll see if we can figure that out. I was going to do a Texas flag with the hammer and sickle as the star, but I can't be putting that out into the world. I actually think I'd probably be annoyed if I saw somebody else wearing that. So that's just going to sit in the ideas folder. But let's see. They don't let you put guns on a hat. I tried. That logo needs 2 Colt 45s across. Yeah, they won't let you put guns on the thing. Left Reckoning hats will be out soon. The tank top will be out soon as well, and hopefully we'll be able to get these shirts out. I mean, next week, once I get the mock-ups of everything, we'll put them out. I want to make sure they look good because, not to be, after Michael passed, y'all, it was like really hard on me because everyone, and I appreciate everybody supporting everything at that moment, but all these people bought like t-shirts, and the merch operation that they had set up was not equipped for that. And so I grieving my friend, and for like 5 weeks I was getting emails from people. Again, I'm not personally upset with anybody there. I understand if you bought something, you want to get it, but I just learned my lesson in that moment that we're not going to launch until we are ready to go. So hopefully the next couple of weeks. Anyways, y'all, I'll see y'all Sunday, and if not, see y'all next week. Take care, everybody, and read the piece, and have a good weekend.